Winning the Testimony War by Lynn A. Bryson. Preface. As anxious masses await, the war correspondent sends his vital communications back from the front line. His messages do not bring relief. They tell of a battle that is being lost. All are left wondering, is there any hope for a victory? Are they all to die? Brothers and fathers perish in ever-increasing numbers. The enemy has become so terrible that in his thirst for blood he has lost all reason. And now their strongest positions have fallen. Where is the message of hope? They cry out for any word from the front. If they do not soon hear how the battle has turned, panic will soon send all of the young reserves fleeing. Just then, a runner comes soaring down the pathway that leads to the front. As he regains his breath, he cries out, "We are winning!" At once everyone cheers loudly. Then they all go hushed to hear how this could be so. The general has asked me to relay his message to all of the people. As the next words pass the lips of the war correspondent, the people are shocked. The general expressed a desire to have everyone called to the front lines. He expressed the fear that if everyone did not heed his urgent call, the enemy could regroup and overrun them all. This caused such a great uproar among the people that they dragged the war correspondent into court and found him guilty of trying to stir up trouble, and they would not even let him go back to the front himself. And while the war raged on without the war correspondent, the general wondered why no one came up the pathway. Did the people not know that soon the enemy would swoop past the troops defending the front line and then descend upon the entire nation and slay them all, he wondered? But the people were instead comforted by the knowledge that the war correspondent had been silenced. Hearing no more about the war, they quickly forgot that there was a war. How the enemy rejoiced! For now he could first defeat all of those fighting valiantly at the front, and afterwards easily thrash those who were growing fat and lazy in their city in the mountains. The general sent many more war correspondents into the city to deliver his message again and again, but each time the people rejected the message because no one wanted to go to the front. Meanwhile, the enemy marveled when he heard what would happen to each war correspondent. He marveled at how eager the people of the city were to defeat themselves. I see my children before me. As the testimony war rages around us here, I wonder what might become of them if I should die before I have a chance to teach my little ones what lies ahead in the war. So, this book is for them. I have found that if a man decides to serve God with all of his might, mind, and strength, that he will be opposed by many who call themselves saints. It is not easy to explain away the reasons why men do this to each other, except to say that they all perceive themselves as being good, and they perceive anyone who differs in approach as being bad. Now, whenever two men get the idea that only one of them is a good guy, and that the other guy is the bad guy, they start to destroy each other, and they do it in the name of the Lord. And many are they that are thus destroyed. The dictionary lists the word proclivity as a noun meaning a natural tendency in human nature, inclination, especially towards something discreditable or naughty, as a proclivity to vice. There is a tendency that men have to destroy each other in the name of the Lord, and this tendency involves a principle that I shall call the proclivity principle. And this principle, operating upon the people of the city then, is the reason that the war correspondent in the preceding illustration was dragged into court and flogged for warning the people about their forthcoming demise. I started this book with that parable of mine to illustrate how the proclivity principle might be working now among the Latter-day Saints. I will attempt to illustrate in this book how I have come up against this principle, working in opposition to my efforts time and time again. When men in ancient times met the prophets of old, they employed the proclivity principle as they stoned the prophets. Men today traditionally employ the proclivity principle by sending lawyers after anyone with whom they disagree. Often, this is more effective than stoning. Continually having to waste your efforts fighting off lawyers when you are falsely accused puts you in the same state as if you were being stoned. Ask anyone who has been there. This book is my testimony, to add to the many on the side of a belief in God and on the side of a belief in His Son, Jesus Christ. However, in this story you will find that I have been attacked by many of my own faith. This should only serve to verify that what I have just said about the proclivity principle is true. And you will also read that I have been trying to serve God, and that this has usually brought on the attacks that are mentioned herein. I will leave it to you to decide whether you would have joined me or my attackers. I have been warned by many of my friends that many who read this book will serve to prove that the proclivity principle is altogether too alive and well among the saints, as the book, they fear, will stir up more opposition to my efforts to accomplish my goals as they are outlined in this book. This book is written mainly for my children, but I cannot help but wonder if by writing this book I may strengthen the testimonies of many who have been hurt by other so-called saints. All men have a tendency to leave any faith that contains enemies. We tend to judge religions by their members. If we meet an evil Jew, we tend to distrust all Jews. But the proclivity principle works against all good men in every religion. So it would be wrong for you to decide that because I have met some evil Mormons, that there is something wrong with all or a great number of Mormons. It would be my hope that you would rather determine in your heart that something very strong must be pulling me toward the Mormon religion if I can go through all of this and still be a Latter-day Saint. I have shown this manuscript to many of my friends, some in very high offices in the LDS Church. Some of them have been delighted to read of the many spiritual experiences that testify to the truth of the gospel, but some have expressed the fear that I may be dragged into court and flogged for bringing this message forth in my book. To them I say, I am writing this book as a war correspondent, and if I am successful at delivering the general's message to the anxious masses who so desperately need it, then I may yet see many friends leave their empty lives behind, and I may yet see them join in the battleground at the front in the testimony war. Chapter 1. The most important thoughts are the ones that lead a man to God. Some are always thinking such thoughts, but some never do. When I was a young boy, all I could ever think about was baseball. Each year I would try out for Little League Baseball. Each year I would go through the heartache of being the last one dropped from the team in the final cut as the coach narrowed the team down to the 15 maximum players. When I was 12, I knew that this would be my last chance because after the age of 12, a boy is too old for Little League. I didn't want to go through life with that on my head, that I was the only one of my friends who never made the team. As soon as the snow went away, I practiced every move you can make with a baseball, all to no avail. The same stupid thing happened again. I was the last boy dropped from the team. Trudging home, I fell into deep despair in my locked bedroom. No one in my family even seemed to notice. It was just something that I wanted to do very badly, to play baseball, and to each of the members of my family it was something of very little importance. I think that this is possibly what made it all the more important to me. I had little or no religious training in my home. God was rarely ever talked about. None of my family went to church regularly, although I think that they all believed in God. But in this pitiful state, my thoughts were made to turn to God. I had no one else to talk to about it. I asked God, perhaps sounding a little like the Jew in Fiddler on the Roof, if it would foul up some great eternal plan if I could be a baseball player. I wondered to God if there was some great reason why I had to be hurt so badly year after year. I didn't see anything so terribly worthy about some of the other guys who made the team each year. In fact, I felt that I was a little better than a couple of them. Well, so go the thoughts of a 12-year-old boy. Can you imagine how I felt a few weeks later when the coach of one of the teams called to say that he heard that I was available and that his team lost one player when a family went on summer vacation? I not only got the chance to be on a team, but I actually got to start each game. Then I had the dream of every little leaguer that ever warmed the bench coming true before my very eyes. I finished the season with the highest batting average in the whole city, a whopping .440. And to top it off, I was selected to play in the All-Star tournament. The Lord had really answered my prayers, but I was soon to learn that the Lord has a way of keeping us humble. The coach of the All-Star team had a son that played my position. You guessed it. He played the games of the All-Star tournament while I warmed the bench. It's funny how all things are relative to something else. Now, instead of being thrilled to death to be lucky enough to get to play at all, I was crushed to find out how unfair the world is to truly great athletes. We all spend a lot of our time in this thinking mode, don't we? Instead of thinking how great it is to be alive and well, we ponder for a few moments what it would be like to be alive and well and handsome and rich. And then we don't feel so good anymore. In fact, it is this type of thinking that can pretty soon actually make us sick. And for real irony, those that are actually already handsome and rich often can't think about anything else but what it would be like to not have all of those problems that go with being handsome and rich. Think about that for a while. Boy, when you're rich, you've got to spend a lot of time with the IRS, they tell me. And when you're handsome, I'll tell you, I've never had a day of rest in my life. It's true. There is no time when you reach some utopia where you don't feel disappointed. I'm told that even God spends time being disappointed in some of us. And as I have said, the most important thoughts are the ones that lead a man to God, to make a man try not to be so disappointing to God. And I began to think about God almost as much as baseball. Now my eyesight began to go downhill, and by the next baseball season, I was wearing glasses. I did okay as a ball player, but I was never to achieve the supremacy as an athlete that I wanted. So was my prayer answered or not? Thank heaven, our prayers are answered by some sort of a program that takes the wording as we send up the prayer and translates the prayer into what we really mean to say. For example, when we pray for strength, the Lord sends us problems to overcome that will make us stronger, right? I learned another very nice lesson from this experience in my youth. I learned that when little boys get their hearts broken in Little League baseball, that we don't need to close down all of the Little Leagues. I learned that this sort of an experience can build a fire under some little boys that will help them to become young men. For me, this fire provided the cutting edge. By the time I entered college, I had acquired a sufficient will to succeed to win 4 offers for scholarships, which would pay my tuition in my choice of 4 different fields. All of this because I learned that the magic method for getting rid of pain when you cannot achieve in one area is simply to go achieve in some other area. Perhaps I would not have developed enough of a desire to achieve in these 4 areas had I not been so thoroughly burned up about baseball. Who knows? One of the areas of scholarship that I excelled in was writing. Maybe I owe to my disappointment in baseball the very existence of this book. Now, if this is a principle that the Lord wanted me to learn, that we can better achieve things in life if we have had to endure a little disappointment, then the Lord did a bang-up job with me. Take, for example, a guy that I grew up disliking more than any other person in my whole childhood. He married my high school sweetheart. Besides that, he was the best baseball player that I ever saw. When things get that bad, all of your friends tell you that the darkest hour comes just before the dawn. However, I was convinced by now that the darkest hour comes just before a permanent eclipse. It was during this darkest hour that the Lord sent into my life some guiding light by the name of Pat Boone. Pat Boone was a member of the Church of Christ, like me. I was touched by the way he was able to attract huge numbers of young people and how he was able to preach some sense into their needy little heads. I marveled at how the world had produced only one Pat Boone among so many other entertainers. The same is true about Walt Disney. How is it that the world has only produced one Walt Disney among so many movie makers? I thought how wonderful life would be if I could ascend the ladder of success and become another Walt Disney type. I deemed it far better to be a Walt Disney type than a Pat Boone type with respect to the fact that producer-directors like Mr. Disney actually create stars like Mr. Boone. Here then was the seed that started me wanting to achieve more than anything else, the seeking and finding of the abilities I would need to be a producer in the entertainment field. I would answer the world's needs for leaders like Pat Boone not by becoming a star, but by being someone who could give stardom to other deserving persons. I saw in my youth that the real heroes of the masses were not those who claimed to be philosophers, and I saw that the ministers have a terrible time ministering. I saw that the most powerful way to preach is by example, and most importantly, I saw that the more visible a person becomes, the more power he has to preach. Isn't it apparent that the prevailing dress, speech, moral standards are those of the people who are deemed to be popular by virtue of their being in the public eye? Seemingly, people seldom take into consideration why the person is popular when they start to follow whatever that person says is right to do. To illustrate, I can now reflect upon many experiences, such as one in Salt Lake City, where I saw several thousand youth attending a rock concert at the Terrace Ballroom. On large movie screens behind the group performing, there was shown constant psychedelic images, including perverted scenes superimposed over images of the Salt Lake Mormon Temple. I was only in attendance because I was paid to be there as an entertainer. I was the local DJ that was asked to come and introduce the famous group. As I looked out over the audience, I could see thousands of youth being swept into a trance by this lurid display. And the worst part of all was that these were Salt Lake's finest youth. Some of them were faithful Mormon youth. The preceding story happened when I was a DJ in Salt Lake City in 1968. But 10 years previous, I was trying to decide what I would do to combat the forthcoming onslaught of changes that the pop music scene would foist upon the masses. As I neared my 20th birthday, I could see rock music rising so fast as a tool so powerful that if Christians did not wield this tool in their favor, that the devil would surely wield it in his favor. I thought these thoughts 10 years before the Beatles. I cannot count the times during those 10 years that I argued this case against those that thought that rock music was of the devil merely because the devil had the wisdom to pick up this potent tool first. When the Beatles crashed in to cash in, the world was transformed under the sheer skill of a well-tooled attack. I would like to compare rock music to an axe. Both are tools of destruction, but both are tools of construction as well. Rock music, like an axe, can penetrate to the very core of hardest resistance, so that even pure light may pass. How is this so? The one wielding the axe decides whether to strike a blow for good or evil. The music is merely the axe, not being good or evil, if it merely has a captivating beat. Note, I am not talking about lyrics yet, or style of body movements while performing. Those things have an obvious good or evil value about them. I am just talking about the music itself, which many people wrongfully perceive to be of the devil, when it would be closer to the truth for them to notice that the way the music is handled is of the devil. With that picture in your mind, of the music represented merely as an axe, now picture the entertainer as a woodsman. Picture the youth of today as trees, about to be hewn down, or about to be fashioned into beautiful tabernacles of truth. The overwhelming majority of today's woodsmen are voracious beetles destroying every tree in sight. I wanted to send into the forest woodsmen who were true carpenters for the Lord. You see, if the music can capture the attention of such a huge number of seeking and needing youth, then it must be useful if placed in the hands of those who will refuse to sing suggestive lyrics, and who will also refuse to parade their bodies in an unseemly manner. If this music is truly like an axe, in that it opens the mind for teaching by virtue of the increased attention span, if for no other reason, then Christians must learn to use this power, and stop decrying its strength just because the devil thought to use it first. To take the analogy one step further, some entertainers are so unlike the carpenters that they can fittingly be described as rolling stones. They crush everything in their pathway, masticating the poor timbers that have barely been left standing by the disease-bearing beetles that have preceded them. So at the early age of 18, at a time when the forest was already looking pretty shabby, I began my career in radio and TV with a great deal of success. My work at Radio KPKW in Pasco, Washington, gave me an immediate taste of what it would be like to put all of my ideas about being influential with the masses to work. Starting in February 1958, I had what seemed to be an instant large following. I added to my radio show a teenage nightclub, 4 very successful TV series, and I often found myself signing autographs. I never wanted nor expected this to lead to national acclaim. However, I did hope that it would provide the training that I would need to later become another Walt Disney type, famous or not. I found a new ability springing forward. I discovered that I could compose the music that I liked to hear, rock music. I wondered how good I really was. I decided that there was one way I could find out. I would follow a carefully ordered plan. I would first excel as a disc jockey. If I could do this well enough, somewhere in a large city, a record company would one day become attracted to me as a person that could do them a favor. Then I would ask them to become interested in me as a songwriter. I would thus become a famous songwriter. Then, with all of the riches that my songwriting would bring, I would first build a recording studio. Then, after creating dozens of Pat Boone types, I would have enough wealth to swing right on to dream number 2, launching a movie company, and become another Walt Disney. Small dream, eh? I think that the main reason that I knew that I would succeed was somehow tied up in my belief that the world needed for this to happen. Clearly, it seemed to me, if God needs it to be so, then it will be so. Destiny would be on my side. Had I not already proven to myself that I could attract a following with my numerous radio and TV shows? I have to laugh now as I realize that all of these plans were remarkably correct, and that my life has gone entirely according to the plans of an 18-year-old boy, me. I would like to impress upon my children that Heavenly Father gives us revelation always sufficient for the hour of need. And at age 18, when we must be planning our whole future, we can have the mountain of answers that we need. And my laughing turns to soberness when I realize that these plans, then, were not just the dreams of an 18-year-old boy after all. They were, in fact, directions from God. Chapter 2. My life was childhood until the night I met Sherry. She appeared on my TV show as the local homecoming queen. At first sight of her, I wanted to find a way to be such a good boy that God would not find any reason why I couldn't have her to be my girlfriend. Sherry was home one Sunday when I finally got enough nerve to call her on the phone. I asked her to go to the Sunday night picture show. I must have held my breath the entire time we talked on the phone so she wouldn't hear me gasping for air. You might say I was a little nervous. She replied, "I'm sorry, Lynn, but my religion doesn't think too highly of going to the movies on Sunday. But I would like you to take me to church tonight if you'd like to come. We're Mormons." Now let me tell you why I almost passed out. It wasn't from lack of air. I was at that time teaching a Sunday school class in the Church of Christ. We were presently studying out of a text called Mormonism Exposed. I had been to a Mormon church several times before. Many of my childhood friends had been Mormons, but they had invited me to a Mormon Boy Scout troop where, after several meetings, I decided not to attend anymore because, one, most of the fellows liked to tell dirty jokes during the prayers, and two, one of them stole my bicycle during the scout meeting. So you can see my exposure to Mormonism had not been what you would call high level. So I welcomed this opportunity to see why reasonable people would attach themselves to such a queer religion. By this time of my life, I had picked up the vice of drinking once in a while. But for this great person, I gave up drinking forever. She made this request of me on our first date as a prerequisite for any more dates, and I easily went for that. I wrote this in the hopes that some young LDS girl would get the idea that they have a great deal of power. To this day, I keep that promise made to a girl of 16. I also entered a deep study of religion, all for this girl. I wanted to pull her away from what I thought was a very foolish religion. After attending church with Sherry, I could hardly wait to see her again. This was the week of my 20th birthday, Thanksgiving week, 1959. A somewhat remarkable event occurred that week. Prior to calling Sherry on Sunday, I had such a strong premonition that I told my friends that on my upcoming 20th birthday, my entire life was going to change. I didn't know how I knew this thing, only that I knew it for sure. To say the least, when I turned 20 that week, I was somehow made aware in advance that the womb of time was about to deliver a major change in my life. Sherry and I had our first date on Sunday. We went to her church. Later in the week, we went to a movie. When we came home, we sat out in front of her house until 4 a.m. Boldly, she invited me in to meet her mother at 4 a.m. Her mother awoke, and we had a very nice chat. This girl had won the respect of her parents to the degree that her mother knew that Sherry was all right, and she was not worried at all. Her main concern was over whether or not Sherry was having any success explaining the Mormon church to me, for that is exactly what we had been doing out in that parked car until 4 a.m., discussing the Mormon church. Later, my friends asked what had happened on my 20th birthday that might have had some significance. True love, I told them. However, it was instead that my earlier premonition had been fulfilled to the most exacting degree. I was soon to learn the meaning of what it is to be born again. In the next few months, I studied her religion constantly. I studied from such unbiased books as Mormonism Exposed, Joseph Smith, Prophet or Profiteer, and others written by Church of Christ people. Sherry only went to church at my church once. She said that she knew with all her heart and soul that her church was true. This was very disappointing to me. Nevertheless, I thought that by attending her church I would still persuade her to open her mind a little at a time. I told her about a book that I had been reading called People's Padre. It was the story of a Catholic priest in his 30s that had left the Catholic Church because he no longer felt that it was the truth. I asked her how it was that a 16-year-old girl could know something that older and wiser people could not know. She retorted, "Okay, you tell me. How can anyone know the truth?" My answer got me into deep water. I said, after men have graduated from great religious schools, then they are prepared for their ministries. Such men surely know the truth more than anyone else. She quizzically stated, "Oh, I get it. All such graduates of such grand institutions all belong to the same church because of their great learning, right?" She had me there. Obviously, after men get very much learning, they do little to demonstrate that they can agree with any other greatly learned man. So I asked her, "How then do you propose that men may know the truth?" Now, you've got to remember that this was a 16-year-old girl I was talking to, and she answered with all the wisdom of a sage. Wouldn't it be wonderful if God had prepared a way for even a small child to know the truth, if he really wanted it, by the age of 8? That way a person could spend his entire life serving God instead of aimlessly wandering about looking for the truth. And how I wished that this were true. I began to feel that if Mormonism were not entirely true, it certainly offered some beautiful concepts that ought to be true. How much the world could benefit. She added, "God has prepared such a way, and I have always known the truth by the power of the Holy Ghost." Sherry then told me that if she ever lacked an answer about any problem, that she had been instructed to write down the problem. Then she would pray about that problem. She said that in this way one may know for certain that a prayer has been answered. Too many people pray only in general terms, and so they only get general answers that are hard to pin down. But if a person prays specific prayers, then the answers become more specific, and they're quite easy to discern. She then gave me the pamphlet called The Joseph Smith Story. She thought that this pamphlet would illustrate what she meant by getting specific answers to specific prayers. I had said to her, "Oh, sure, if I pray specific questions, then God will send an angel bopping into my room with the answer." She smiled. "Read the pamphlet." Also, at her urging, I attended a strange class held 1 hour before high school each morning at her church called Early Morning Seminary. I expected to see about 5 people in the class at that hour. I remember once our minister had asked my Sunday school class to come down to paint some windows on the church building on a Saturday morning, and no one showed up. So I was really amazed to see several classes totaling over 100 in attendance. That night at the radio station following my show, I mentioned this seminary class to my boss, John Wages, and his wife, Teddy. When I said I was quite impressed with several of the Mormon concepts, John told me that he was not at all impressed with the Christian concept of church as a whole. He said that a major fault in modern churches was that men worshiped a God that they did not even know. I retorted to him that it was easy to know God. He said, "Describe him for me." I gave him that time-worn phrase that one does not need to see God to know him. But John then fired off some questions that started me reeling. Is God male or female? Is Jesus God or the Son of God? Did God create Jesus? Did God create you? If so, then you were cheated, my friend, for God purposely made Jesus better than he made you. And now he holds you accountable for your sins after he made you to be a sinner. It is as if God were once some giant baker in the sky. He made one biscuit perfect, and then he half-baked all of the rest of us. And now he is angry at the poor biscuits that didn't come out right. And what kind of a God would assign one spirit to being a Satan? As a biscuit, Satan came out cooked to a crisp. And as a cook, God is a failure. Now he threatens to destroy all of mankind unless we straighten out his mistakes. What kind of God is that? I was stricken by this barrage of questions. I went to my car after John and Teddy left the station. I wanted to retrieve the pamphlet, The Joseph Smith Story. I felt impressed to read it again. I came again to the part where Joseph said that he read from the Bible the verse in the 1st chapter of James that says, "If any of you lack wisdom, you should ask of God," and the promise that God would reveal his truths to anyone that would ask. And I thought that maybe even I could be classed as an anyone in the eyes of God. So why not ask now? I was alone at KPKW. We were signed off. In a moment, I would sign on with a prayer transmitting to the gates of heaven itself that would recast my entire life. Joseph Smith had testified that he had seen God as a result of his inquiry. I did not feel that Joseph Smith was a liar, but I did not know that he was not either. I reasoned that it did not matter if he were a liar or not. What really mattered for me right then was knowing whether or not that verse in James could be true. If that verse be true, then I could talk to God myself. In fact, there is no problem in this universe that matters if that solitary verse in the book of James is true. So I began to pray. Because of what I am about to tell you, some of you will have to wonder about me in the same manner that I once wondered about Joseph Smith. You may not feel that I am a liar, but you also might not know that I am not. And I suppose that has been the dilemma of the world for a long time. Some of us having a spiritual experience, and the rest of us wondering if any of us are sane. I had signed off the radio station at 10 p.m. I had talked to the Wages until about 10:45 p.m. I had read the pamphlet until about 11 p.m. Then I had begun to pray at about 11 p.m. By 12:30 a.m., I had been praying for about an hour and a half. I had received no answer. I was basically inquiring about the nature of God. I was trying to be very specific with my wording. I was asking questions like, "God, what are you? And what about this biscuit and baker relationship of ours?" I decided while praying that if God did not answer me, then the possibilities loomed that A, God did not know what he was, B, he did not consider me to be an anyone, C, the verse in James is not true. Just when the feeling changed from one of honest inquiry to one of stark fear, and I actually became frightened that maybe God did not exist, in my deep self I felt an inquiry coming back at me. "Lynn Bryson, who do you think you are? Do you realize that if you were given the answer to this question, that you would know far more than most of the men who have ever lived upon this earth?" I had to admit that God has the right to be choosy, And I knew that there has to be a price tag on revelation. But the price tag that one must pay if he never receives a single revelation has got to be the more expensive price tag, for if you never receive any knowledge about God, you will surely lose your soul. And the irony of it all is that God himself would lose you as one of his children if it were not possible to receive revelation from him as to which path to take here upon this earth. And surely he must be concerned about us more than to leave us alone here. Thus I knew that I would get an answer to my prayer. The only question that remained was, when? I locked up the radio station and drove home. I fell asleep still asking, when? I awoke about 5 a.m. I was eager to take Sherry to another seminary class. Sister Eva Brown came to the front of the class she had taught for so many years. Words cannot express my feelings as she came forth after the opening prayer, stepped to the board with chalk in hand, and wrote the words, "What is God?" She turned around in front of me and said, "This question is not even phrased right." And she turned to the board and crossed out the word "what" and changed it to read, "Who is God?" She said, "God is a who, not a what." God is an exalted man. Jesus is his literal child. We are the children of God also. We were born as spirits with bodies composed of light to our Father and our Mother in heaven. Now that really fell like a giant ringing bell on my mind. I had never heard that concept expressed before anywhere. She continued, "Most of the world has never known this great truth. But have you ever seen a father where there was no mother? The things that we learn here on earth are for a greater purpose later, as we apply them in heaven. Once we find out that we started out with bodies of light, then we see the wisdom of trying to obtain bodies of flesh and bone and blood. And we see why Satan has told the people on earth to believe that God does not have a body of flesh and bone. Satan was cast out of heaven for rebellion. He never got to come to earth to receive a body like ours. He knows that if we are true to the commandments of God, that we will be given an immortal body like the one that God is wearing. Once we obtain another body, which will be like God's, we may receive knowledge like God has. And then we will become gods also. That is how God became God, for he was once just a man on another planet like ours. Again, this flood of truth was overwhelming to me. Suddenly, a great deal became clear to me. I saw that there was no biscuit-baker relationship between God and man. Instead, I saw that we are masters of our own destiny. I once had heard the remark made by a hobo who said, "I would give $1,000 to be a millionaire," and that is why he is still a hobo. Once a great pianist was told by an admirer, "I'd give my life to be able to play the way that you can play." The great pianist replied, "I did." And that is why most of us are not great pianists. We are exactly what we have chosen to be. God has cheated no one. We have only cheated ourselves. She added, "Man thinks that he can know everything through science. But even Einstein observed that we cannot see beyond the reach of the most powerful microscope or beyond the reach of the most powerful telescope. We are trapped between them both. It is only by revelation that we can reach beyond the veil that surrounds us, and God chooses when he will part the veil and when he will not." How well I knew. The class got up to go. I must have practically floated forward to say to Sister Brown, "Do you teach for each day's lesson a series of prepared lessons from some kind of manual?" "Yes, I have this manual here." "Oh, it must have been a coincidence that you just happened to be discussing this particular subject today." Already the tears were in her eyes as the Spirit of God began to testify to us both as to what had just occurred. Sister Brown spoke softly. "Lynn, did you come to class wondering about the nature of God this morning?" She continued under some difficulty as the words choked past her lips. "Last night I went to bed at about 9 p.m. I had a different lesson prepared. I was awakened at about 11 p.m. with the feeling that I had prepared the wrong lesson. Upon checking, even though I found that I had prepared the lesson in the proper sequence, I felt impressed to prepare a lesson for you on the nature of God. I prayed that Sherry would be bringing you to class again. Do I even need to say it? The verse in James is true. To my children who shall be reading these things after I am gone, this is the first great building block idea that I must leave with you, and you will need to use this truth often. The verse in James is true." Chapter 3. This was no ordinary seminary class. I later found out that everyone had fasted and prayed that I would one day come to seminary and eventually be baptized. There were several who were baptized through the efforts of Sister Brown and her amazing class. The people that I met at that time made me love all Mormons with all my heart. Once I took a list of 30 reasons why I could never be a Mormon to a pair of students from this class named Charles Clement and Donald Enders. They toiled with me for several hours at the church one night. One by one, they gave me the other side of each of the 30 reasons I had listed. When I heard the Mormon explanation for some apparent incongruities within the Mormon doctrine, I began to see that the men who had written these anti-Mormon books, in many cases, having not understood the true Mormon position, had actually lied about what the Mormons believed. How strange, I thought, that men should use falsehood to attack what they deemed to be a falsehood. Misunderstanding is one thing, but out-and-out lies are another. For example, in one anti-Mormon book, they started in on the Mormons for having practiced polygamy, and began quoting Mormon scriptures that said that if anyone did not enter into the, quote, new and everlasting covenant, which is the belief that Mormons have that they must be married to a mate for all time and eternity, that they, the Mormons who did not practice eternal marriage, would be damned. It is obvious that if the Mormons believe that one may have children in the life hereafter, they also believe that if one does not have a mate with which to have children, they will be damned to the degree that they can't possibly have any such children. Now that makes sense to me. But these eager men that wrote some of those anti-Mormon books actually twisted those scriptures about eternal marriage around to where they were telling their readers that Mormons believe that, quote, the new and everlasting covenant referred to polygamy, and that Mormons were now all damned by the Wilford Woodruff Manifesto, which banned the practice of plural marriage in the Mormon Church. If you aren't a very good listener, such men can really confuse the issue for you. You see, polygamy wasn't banned because leaders of the church thought it was a mistake, and the scriptures about eternal marriage and the new and everlasting covenant have nothing to do with polygamy. But when I found this out from Charlie and Don, I had to wonder what or who clouded the minds of these other men so badly. The Lord does not work in that way to lead men to the truth, but the devil works in just that way to turn men away from the truth. Well, I could go on for hours about that meeting with Charlie and Don. At the conclusion of that sweet meeting, we left the room where we had been at the church and discovered that everyone else had left the building and had turned off all of the lights. Not being familiar with that hallway, I remember feeling a little afraid to venture out into the complicated maze of hallways for fear that I might wander around in the dark forever. But Charlie ran ahead in the dark. I heard his voice off in the blackness calling back to me, "Hang in there while I find the switches to the lights." As Charlie flipped on each light switch, leading me from place to place through that unfamiliar building, I was instantly impressed with the obvious parallel between what was happening with the light switches and what had just happened with the mountain of information that Charlie and Don had just illuminated for my benefit. And here, then, is a warning for my children. Never be afraid to walk down a dark hallway with your hand in the hand of God, for that is much better than walking in complete light and making all of the decisions on your own. God wants you to learn to make your own choices, but there are times when we would just waste time wandering around in the dark. When you find that you have been cast into such a situation, find someone who knows where the light switches are fast, for God has promised that there will always be such a person, man or angel or even God himself. I also met the stake missionaries, Major and Marjorie Burkhead. She was bedridden during these missionary discussions. Her doctor had told her to refrain from all such confrontations, but she would not. She told me that she had been forewarned in her dreams to prepare always for a mission to some dark-skinned people. Even though she had just suffered a serious setback to her health, she felt she should still prepare for that forthcoming mission. She gave me much insight that no one before nor since has given to me, and I had a need that she alone could have fulfilled. Years later, her husband was called to be groundskeeper for the Hawaiian temple, and she was asked to fill a mission to guess who. Of course, these are the kinds of things that worldly people shrug off as being mere coincidences. But in the testimony war, it is important to keep account of how frequent such mere coincidences keep merely coinciding. The Lord has told us that he will put a pattern in all things, that we may recognize his hand in all things. By mid-April 1960, I was very near to baptism into the LDS religion, but something began to tear at me. What if I were being deceived? Millions were Catholic because of the miracles like the miracle of Our Lady of Fatima, which occurred in Portugal in 1917, wherein several thousand people saw the sun change colors and plunge toward the earth. How were such things to be explained? If Joseph Smith had seen God as he had claimed, and God told him that all of the churches existing on this earth are simply founded on the beliefs of men and not on the truth. Every religion has its miracles, yet can every religion be true? The religions of this world cannot all be all true. They are all so conflicting that no two of them can both be true. No two viewpoints can both be true if they are in direct opposition to each other. So I repeat, no two churches can both be true. Only one church can be true at a time, or none. Even as a child, I was always amazed at the number of people who believed that all religions were true, and that it didn't matter which church you went to so long as you were trying to live a good life. I think most people who think this way do so because they also think that there is no way that anybody can study long enough to find out which church is right. My guess is that people just must reason that if God is a loving God, He won't send anybody to hell just for being baptized in the wrong way. For example, my brother Kenneth was killed at the age of 2 by a horse. My mother took his broken and innocent body to a Catholic hospital to try and save his life. When the nuns wanted to baptize him while he was still alive, my mother refused, saying that if God would not take this blessed little boy into His arms just the way he was, then God was a little too particular. In fact, she said that if this were so, then God was a wicked God, and who would want to be baptized into His kingdom anyway if God could be so cruel? I always thought that she had a good point. So the point is at least somewhat valid. But how far can you take it? For example, isn't it necessary to have at least some laws that govern the entrance to the kingdom of God? And what if we consider the words of Christ and find that the very first law is faith? And what if faith demands that you obey all the laws, even when you don't understand them? And what if that means that all little children need to be baptized? And what if that means that God is very cruel, and therefore nobody wants to serve such a God? In other words, if it were put to a vote, my mom would have voted against a plan that would have required her to have faith in the words of those nuns. She was not voting against having faith in Christ. She voted for having faith in a Christ who would be kind enough to take care of her little baby boy. Now, do you see what I mean about conflicting viewpoints? Either those nuns were right, and my baby brother is in hell roasting, or my mother was right, and my baby brother is somewhere among the angels. Do you really think that they both can be right at the same time? My baby brother cannot be both places at the same time, or else all of God's angels are roasting right alongside of my baby brother. That's the only way they could both be right. Probably the thing that turns people off more than anything else about today's Christianity is the constant bickering over which church is right. One non-Mormon who read the manuscript for this book told me that she almost threw the book down in disgust when she came to this part, where she thought I was trying to say that I believe that the Mormon church was the only true church. Well, that is what I am leading up to. But you've got to admit that the question is well put that asks, which church is right if two cannot be true? The answer that most people are willing to accept is, all churches have at least some truth in them, and no church is any more true than any other, with a few exceptions. But then you must also conclude that maybe no church is completely true, because then you would have the one true church, and we are back where we started. Maybe we are stuck with only 4 choices. 1, 2 churches that teach opposing doctrines can both be true in spite of the havoc that this would create as people go on burning in hell and living in heaven at the same time, because one church would believe that a certain group should go to heaven, while the opposing church would believe things that would send the same group to hell. And this would mean that if they were both true, then the poor confused group would have to go to both places. 2, another choice would be that since there might not be any true church, we will all go to heaven because God loves us. And this would also turn heaven into something of a hell, as the worst fiends on earth would then have claim to the same heaven as the rest of us. Another option exists within this choice, which is that all churches will advance some of their people to heaven, but God will just reject the really bad ones that didn't live their own religion. But this also has its problems. What do we do with the really objectionable churches, like those that took part in the Jonestown massacre in Guyana? So I guess we have to say that not all churches will promote members to heaven. I heard someone propose that maybe God can change us into nice people when we get to heaven. So maybe he will just save all people who are good by changing them magically into angels. Then what is the point of trying to learn to behave here on earth if we only need to be good enough to qualify for some magical transformation that is going to rescue us from our fallen state? We didn't need Christ's teachings then. All we need is a few bottles of poison so we can get it over with and get on to the part where God changes us into angels. Sounds about the same as whatever they must have told those poor people in Jonestown. 3, and this choice is the one that sounds the most reasonable. There must be one true church, and although all churches may have a little or a lot of truth in them, only one has it all. That would certainly sound like what God would do for us. I mean, that he would take the trouble to give us one true church at least. And it certainly sounds like what men would do. I mean, that they would pervert whatever truths were once on the earth and substitute their own reasoning for the truth. 4, and if you don't accept any of the first 3 choices, then you are stuck with this one choice, that there is no God, no true church, and you are free to ramble after whatever turns you on. But if you have followed all of my reasoning to now, then you must be wondering what led me to believe that the Mormon Church is this one true church. Was it because a humble seminary teacher had been awakened from her sleep to proclaim the answer to a single prayer that I had uttered? Does this alone blast away all of the evidences that testify that other churches are also true? As you can tell, I wanted the Joseph Smith story to be true. It provides a very pleasing answer to a most bothersome dilemma. Any fool can see that our world stands in need of a leader who speaks to God. Not just one who pretends to speak to God, but one who actually does. Such a man would be, by definition, a prophet. If you ask all of the religious leaders in the world if any of them can claim to be this leader who speaks directly and openly to God as one man speaks to another, most all would answer, of course, that they were not. All except the LDS prophets, they affirm with great conviction that they speak to God on a regular basis. And when you meet them, they don't even look crazy. In fact, when you meet them, the first thing that crosses your mind is, yes, I believe God would definitely talk to a man like this one. And you also can't help wishing it were true for the sake of a very needy world. That is just one point that makes the Mormon doctrine so appealing, and there are so many more. Once Joseph Smith was accused of being a false prophet. As he stood before many of his followers, he retorted with words to this effect, "If I am the false prophet that some people say I am, I guess that means I am going to hell. And I guess that means that you who believe in me are going to go to hell also. Well, then let us all go to hell, and let us make sure that we all go to dwell in the same corner of hell, and we shall turn that corner of hell into a heaven because of what we are." I can think of no statement that more clearly shows the strength of the Mormon position. You see, all arguing aside, no one can have a heaven anywhere unless the beings that reside there are heavenly. Now that to me is the most beautiful, simple, and direct statement that could ever be made to unravel hours of debate about who is going to heaven. I have coined an original phrase to remind myself, if I am not heaven to be around, I am not heaven bound. I have a sister-in-law who is non-Mormon. She voiced a strong objection to Mormonism because she felt that although a strong point of Mormonism might be that it made a lot of logical sense, a religion can be true without making any sense at all. And she didn't mind that her church didn't have any answers to life's great questions, such as the one about the biscuit-baker relationship. To her, I responded without any success that if a religion doesn't make any sense, in its blindness it may lead people into a pit, for that is what the Lord says will happen when the blind lead the blind. To put all of these thoughts into one meaningful context, just ask of any religion this one great question. What would the world be like if all of the people in the world were of this one religion and followed all of its teachings? I guess that we could save a lot of time debating if we knew the answer to that one, couldn't we? In the context of this great question, I think there are some obvious failings in some of today's great religious bodies. For example, I have noticed that some religions vote on doctrine. If there is one point that would disqualify a church from being the true church the fastest, it would have to be the notion that it could obtain the truth by majority opinion. What if, for example, the majority voted that God was a giant rock? Would God suddenly transform himself into a rock? Or if a council voted that God is 3 persons in one and also 1 person in 3, would God have to suddenly be that inconsistent? because men said that it was beautiful to believe this way and not inconsistent? Just where can we draw the line if men can vote the truth into office? I say that as soon as you realize that men have voted upon any doctrine that you and your church may believe in, you can rest assured that they were only voting because they have had no revelation from God on the matter. And as the Scriptures say, where there is no vision, the people perish. In other words, at the moment you accept any doctrine that men have voted into being, you are relying upon the arm of flesh and not upon the arm of God. As for me and my house, that is not enough. As we think about that great question, what would the world be like if the whole world were of a religion that believed that you can vote a doctrine to be true by majority opinion instead of knowing all doctrine by revelation from God? I think we have a key to why the world is in such a mess today, because that is what most all people believe. And I find this streak of hardness of heart to be one of the most shocking evidences that Satan is winning the testimony war in too many hearts. For what could play more into Satan's hands and keep people from ever knowing the truth? I suppose I am being very logical, and logic should be able to tell you something about where to find the truth. But logic alone is dangerous stuff. Logic, for example, might tell you that evidences produced by carbon dating will prove that the great pyramids of Egypt were built thousands of years before Adam and Eve first walked the Garden of Eden. How can this be? If Adam was the first man, and he lived less than 6,000 years ago, like the Bible says, then what men were around to build any pyramid that is 10,000 years old? Either carbon dating is not reliable, or Adam was not the first man. Or, as some have proposed, Adam was the first man of the family of man that lived upon this earth, and some men from another family of man came here and built the pyramids and then went away, all before God placed Adam here. Who knows? But here we are, squarely at the place where a lot of good men get so confused that they decide to go and live a good life and forget about religion altogether. But for me, there had to be a way to resolve these conflicts once and for all. I sincerely wanted and believed that I could receive a perfectly simple, stark revelation about which church was true. I had an experience with my prayer being answered before. Why couldn't I ask another time a specific prayer and get a specific answer? So I pleaded this question to the source of all truth. Whose voice has been guiding me to the Mormon church? I knew that I had been guided by a voice that night in the radio station. Either it had been the voice of God or the voice of the devil, and I had to know which for sure. I prayed, Lord, if you are going to answer me this time, make it be certain, that I may know, and not wax softer when the hot sun cometh to question my testimony of the truth. As I prayed about the voice that had been guiding me over this rocky road that leads to the selection of my life's religion, a strong feeling welled up inside of me to search the Scriptures. I was sitting beside a high dresser in the room of a friend. Not even being familiar with the surroundings in that room, I blindly searched the top of that dresser with my hand. My hand then found a book. It was the Bible. That was enough to prompt me to look inside. In my friend's copy of the Bible, he had marked several passages with a red pencil. One caught my eye immediately as I opened right to it. An Old Testament character, whose name I cannot even recall, was praying to God in a circumstance just like mine. He was about to go into battle. He asked that his protection be made sure. He was instructed by the Lord that he would be led by a voice. So naturally, he asked of God that same question that I had just asked. How could he know if the voice that came to lead him were the voice of the Lord or the voice of the devil? I began to tremble as my eyes quickly scanned the page for the answer to this soldier's question, and can't you see why? Is it really just a coincidence that I had approached these verses just as I was praying the same question for myself? Would God be so cruel as to allow such a thing to happen just by chance? The Spirit of our Father in heaven bore strong witness to me as I read on that these words were for me, as much as for the soldier to whom they were first given. Thou shalt hear a voice behind thee saying, Turn to the right, and then turn to the right. And then thou shalt hear a voice behind thee saying, Turn to the left, and then turn to the left. For it will be the voice of the Lord your God guiding you into all things that are righteous. For the voice of the Lord is more powerful than the voice of darkness, and he hears those that love him. I began to cry so profusely at that moment. I dropped the book from my hands. That was unfortunate in one respect. Though I have searched the Old Testament from cover to cover, I have never found that passage again. But even if this story does not convert another soul, that moment will live in my heart long after the earth passes away, for I can testify that the Spirit of the Lord was there in power. It was this Spirit, and not just the wording of those verses, however timely they were, that converted me. I vowed to give my life to the spread of this church, whose true name is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also called the LDS or the Mormons. Once as I was discussing this event with a number of LDS youth while teaching a Sunday school class at BYU, and someone brought up the question that is obvious relative to such situations, for they are frequent within the church, that is, how does one know if such events are not just mere coincidences, really? And I defended my case by saying that this experience was accompanied by such an outpouring of the Spirit, I felt that a coincidence of this magnitude would have been an injustice on the part of God to allow something so powerful to wrongly persuade me to join a false religion. You would have thought that I had just preached the foulest form of false doctrine. The class flew into a rage. One student, who was the most vocal, cited this as an example of drawing a most exaggerated conclusion from what was obviously just a mere coincidence. He cited the fact that he had never had such an experience, and also that if God really wanted to talk to me, he would have just talked. He asked, why would God choose to guide your hands to an existing scripture? If you were worthy to receive a revelation, why would he not just appear and reveal the truth? His main contention, I guess, was that I had no right to claim that I knew any more than he did, and that he did not know what church was true, or if any be true. I had to speak at a fireside one evening, and this idea concerned me, so I again inquired of the Lord, Lord, do you really give answers in this manner, or was this experience of mine a coincidence? I know the intensity with which your Spirit bore witness to me, but since others doubt, don't I risk causing them great harm by sharing a testimony with them that they might not understand? While still on my knees pondering whether I should speak at the fireside that evening and bear my testimony in the same manner as I had in the past, I again felt impressed to search the Scriptures. This time I picked up my own Doctrine and Covenants. It fell open to the 124th section, and my eyes went immediately to the words of the 7th verse. Call ye therefore upon them with loud proclamation, and with your testimony, fearing them not, for they are as grass, and all of their glory as the flower thereof, which soon falleth, and they may be left also without excuse. Again, that same Spirit was in the room. I guess it would be pretty easy to scoff at this sort of a story, but may I say with a loud proclamation that it would be better if you did not. And by this I mean that it would be better not to scoff, for by doing so you will only make it hard to find the truth. And isn't the truth what you want to find? In the preface to this book, I have put forth as a purpose for writing this book the notion that many saints are fighting on the side of the adversary. Some thus employ the proclivity principle and strike down much that is good in the name of the Lord. To further strengthen this premise, I would like to call attention to the many saints who scoff at nearly every testimony meeting. They contend that people should not bear into the open their sacred experiences, since the telling of such stories only makes others look upon the teller as if he were a self-appointed prophet. Thus many are intimidated into keeping their testimonies a secret. I am thankful that I have had this assurance that it is okay with the Lord that I bear my testimony. I hope that my children read this and know that the Lord charges them with the same responsibility, and you too, dear reader. Satan is constantly working such mental traps. By these workings, Satan is able to cause saints to war against each other. It is important that if we are to win the testimony war, that we learn how to make war with our testimonies. I was baptized on April 29, 1960, confirmed a member on May 1st, 1960. I did this because I knew then, as I know now, that this is the one true church on earth, and by writing this book, I shall answer the charge to make my testimony as loud a proclamation as I can. Chapter 4. Immediately following my baptism, Sister Burkhead called and asked for a little chat. She told me that she had a strange dream about me, one in which she saw a council of the devil. In Mormon doctrine, Satan is very real. He could not come to earth and get a body like the rest of us. He was cast out of heaven because he was a very disruptive spirit. He has a lot of friends who were also put out of heaven for the same reasons, and now they dwell here on earth as spirits that are mentioned in the Scriptures as demons. It is a startling fact that most of today's religious bodies do not even claim to have any knowledge about the origin of the demons mentioned in the Bible. To further explain what I have just told you, if you are just now getting acquainted with this great truth for the first time, you should understand that these demons are just like us, but they don't have bodies, and they cannot have bodies ever. That is why we read of them trying to possess other bodies in the New Testament. And it should be comforting to read that the Savior had the power to throw them out of the bodies that they tried to possess. You yourself could have wound up as a demon instead of a person, but you promised to come to earth and obey God. Think what this means if you do not obey God. All of the blood and horror upon this earth comes as a result of efforts put forth by these strange creatures who were once children of God just like we are. These jealous demons, jealous because they now want the bodies that they have been denied for their acts of unfaithfulness, vent their jealousy upon every man, woman, and child on this earth as they try to rob from us any pleasure that we could now obtain by being faithful to God in our earth lives. Men, meanwhile, may be protected from all demons and such by gaining enough of the Spirit of the Lord so as to possess the gifts of God. Numbered among these gifts is the gift of dreaming dreams and having visions, so as to be forewarned of the disasters that Satan and his angels plan to disrupt our progress. It was just such a dream that Sister Burkhead wanted to discuss. In her dream, Sister Burkhead was able to hear Satan's plan to thwart my mission in life, which God had prepared for me. She had observed that Satan would undertake a plan whereby I would be made to feel so lonely that my virtue would seem to be of little consequence in exchange for a few moments to ease the pain of loneliness. Being at that time quite successful in radio and TV, I did not consider loneliness to be much of a threat. About this time, my father asked me to leave home. He wanted to hear no more about Mormonism. The radio station drifted near bankruptcy. Soon my job just sort of faded away. A sudden decline in exposure meant that my teenage nightclub would drift into the hands of a competitor. The sponsor of my biggest TV show decided for the same reason that he could do the MC work on my TV show. In my grief, I suppose that I was not very pleasant to be around, and my relationship with Sherry terminated. I had first become accustomed to being the 12th child of a carpenter, doing without money most of my childhood. Then by the age of 18, I started to enjoy the 2 years of immense prosperity and fame, sometimes making as much as $1,000 per night at my teenage nightclub, plus my income from my radio and TV shows. Now I had lost everything within about 2 months of joining the only true church on earth. It was just as Sister Burkhead's dream had forecast. Frankly, I was not frightened at all. I couldn't convince myself that this was anything but temporary. Prosperity had come so early in life to me, I did not have any idea that it could ever turn out to be an elusive thing. Soon I found a job at Welch's grape juice factory. I really had a struggle with reality. I worked long, miserable shifts, 12 hours through the middle of the night, pulling wet blankets from a giant washing machine. I counted every blanket. It was the only way I could stay awake. Would you believe 37,000 blankets in about 5 weeks? They'd come 2 or 3 at a time through a wringer. My job was too mundane to talk about. You might say the devil threw a wet blanket on my great career. I hit a real low point when one night at the factory someone stole my car containing my watch, my money, and other belongings. The police found it some time later, driven off into the Columbia River. In an effort to raise my self-respect, I asked the local elders quorum if they would assist me on a mission for the church. They refused. Undaunted, I went in for an interview for a mission call. I knew that if the Lord wanted me to go on a mission, that he would prepare a way. He did not prepare a way, and no call to go on a mission ever came. After several months, I took the matter up with the stake president. I told him that I had the desire. Surely there must be some way that I could serve a mission. He told me, however, that he had heard that Howard W. Hunter, the apostle, had never served a full-time mission for the church, and that perhaps it would be my calling to serve some other kind of mission, other than a full-time mission. Not everyone should go on a full-time mission, he said. That made the hurt go away a little bit. The thing that made this hurt the most was that I saw that I was now unable to serve God in any of the ways that I had desired. My career, which I had chosen as a vehicle for reaching the masses, was now reduced to washing blankets at a wine press, something akin to stomping grapes with one's bare feet. Still, I can remember that I did not consider the warning given by Sister Burkhead to be of much consequence. She had told me that I was soon to lose everything that I had going for me, as Satan would rage against me for having found the true religion. She was very afraid that all of the things about to happen to me would shake my testimony. I was hurt, but my testimony was strengthened to think that she had been accurate so far, and I began to gird up my loins a little, thinking that maybe things would get a little tough to bear. Oh, how little I prepared for what was to follow. Harbingers of doom. But God always enrolls you in a program to prepare you for disaster, as his way of letting you know that he cares. Great buckets of wisdom flowed from the following experience, which was the preceding experience to all that followed, if you know what I mean. Bob Carroll, age 16, had just fallen on his hip. A growth had started on his injury and had progressed to the size of a loaf of bread. It was terminal cancer. The local missionaries had invited me over to see him. He had seen me on TV, and it was, to quote the missionaries, a favor to him. Actually, it was a favor to me from Almighty God. After several visits with Bob, he decided to join the church. The missionaries carried him into the font. He cried. I have never seen anything like it. Right before his condition really got worse, I took him to church. I carried him in and sat him down on the pew. We left early because he couldn't stand the pain of sitting there any more. He was a living skeleton. Outside, he wept in the car. I asked if he was weeping because the pain had gotten too hard to bear. He replied, I am crying for joy. This is the first time I have ever gone to church in my whole life. After he was finally confined to a bed in a hospital, I started going down to see him every night. It was always, tell me more about the church. I have to learn everything fast. I guess I felt something like a travel agent, getting a client ready for a trip. I had taught a lot of Sunday school classes, but this was the first time I ever had the privilege of telling the good news to somebody who wanted to absorb everything I knew because he was going away soon, and he wanted to know everything that I knew about where he was going. One night he showed me how his grip was failing. As tight as he could grasp my hand, I could feel no pressure. He could only drink 7-Up, no food. Night after night we talked. We always had a prayer, then I would leave. One night I asked him if he would give the closing prayer. He said that he had always enjoyed our prayers, but that he had never prayed before out loud. He didn't know how to pray. I told him he hadn't time to mess around and he'd better be learning. Then I found myself in deep thought. How could he find anything to pray about? Getting him to include any trace of thanksgiving would be a little tough. He had just shown me huge sores all over his back and across the backs of his legs. In his miserable state, if he could find anything to be thankful for, I would be completely amazed. The skin was literally wearing off of his body as he moved each day against the sheets. The suffering was so great for him, he was no more than a flesh-covered sack of bones. His muscles had all virtually disappeared, leaving his eyes sunken clear back into his head. My heart was almost bursting with pity. But he, in the most triumphant gesture I have ever been blessed to see, raised both of his fists over his body and began to pray. Dear, 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 dear God, thank you for giving me 16 beautiful big years on earth. I know I'll be coming home soon, but this earth was just too much. This has really been fun. With those fists of his raised up high, he used them to imitate a walking motion, pushing forward first one fist, then the other, and saying, thanks for school. Walking from class to class was one of the all-time most beautiful, really great thrills. Going left, right, moving along in my very own body power, saying hi to all of the friends that you gave to me as they'd pass me in the hallway. Lord, that was so great. He had to stop. Great tears rolled forward. He was actually overcome with joy. I could just barely take it all in. I'll never forget it. Finally, he just sobbed really hard, broke all the way down, and said, how can I ever repay you for all of these great blessings, Lord? I have just learned about your church. Is there anything that I can still do for you before it is too late? Well, thanks again, Lord. Come and see me when I get home. Amen. Through his tears, he squinted up at me and whispered, now what do I need to say? All I could say back to him was, nothing. I'm telling you, I almost passed out. I had prayed for a greater understanding of my terrible plight. I thought that the Lord had mistreated me so. I had wondered how the Lord could expect anyone to get overly excited about serving him when he was always putting us through such unexplainable trials. Now I knew something about proper attitude that I did not know before I met Bob. I was away at BYU 1 month later, February 1961, when I heard through a friend's letter that Bob had died. Upon hearing this news, I was overcome with a feeling passing through me like the wind that said, thanks, pal. Everything that you have taught to me was all true, and it was far better for me to have known these things before I got here. It has made quite a difference. It was experiences like this one that led me eventually to accept the promptings that were telling me to forget about planning for a full-time mission, that perhaps the Lord had other plans for me. In the patriarchal blessing that I received just before I left for Brigham Young University, a very special mission was at last promised to me. But when I obtained a written copy of that blessing, some months later, the paragraph regarding this prophetic promise of a mission was changed a great deal. Mormons have a belief that a patriarchal blessing given by the proper priesthood authority is the binding promise of God to you. Such blessings are given once in every member's life. They often contain great prophecy that unfolds in a sometimes uncanny manner, and such incidents are often solid evidence of the validity of the Mormon claim to be the only true church. No other church offers such a thrilling doctrine like the opportunity of hearing through God's appointed mouthpiece specific instructions that God has for you. This promise of a mission among the youth of the church was so encouraging to me on the night that it was given that I went home and wrote it down. Upon receiving the written blessing, with its apparent changes, I called long distance to the patriarch that had given the blessing to verify that there had in fact been a change in the wording. The patriarch indicated that he had made a tape recording of the actual blessing. The usual procedure would be to make the written copy from this tape, but in my case the microphone had developed a short. Certain portions of the tape were left blank, so a change probably occurred as he made up words to fill in the blanks. Nevertheless, the blessing was still my blessing, he assured me, and if I remembered certain portions better than he, then he told me I should write them on the back of the written copy. This was very important to me. I was at that time of my life trying to decide if I should pursue a career in the broadcast media, in keeping with my notion that I could serve the Lord best in a field where I could reach the masses. The patriarch's words were quite in line with this notion. The blessing, as it was spoken to me, told of how the Lord had prepared me for a work among the youth that would fulfill my mission here on earth. The blessing, as it was now worded in the written copy, said instead that tithing is a key part of the commandments of God, and admonished me to remember that the windows of heaven are not closed to those that have tithed. From this odd circumstance came another odd sort of a message from the Lord. Inquiring with another patriarch on the BYU campus, this man pointed out to me how the wording about my mission had been replaced by a charge to not forget to tithe. And if the Lord were trying to tell me in a very special way, for really could this be called an accident, that accomplishing my mission would possibly be predicated upon my obedience to tithing. He asked how I was doing at tithing. I sheepishly remarked that I had not yet tithed a single time since I had joined the church. I had one crippling dollar disaster after another, and well, I didn't think the Lord expected me to start tithing until I got back on my feet. That patriarch boomed out, "Do you want your mission or not?" Since then, tithing has not been one of my problems, without my whole life caving in financially each time it has been one of my problems. And to my children, if tithing is omitted from your lives, do you think that you will find your missions? Paying tithing does not guarantee material success, but it does guarantee that the windows of heaven are not closed to those that have tithed. And it is through the windows of heaven that we hear the answers to all of our prayers. Chapter 5. At BYU, I was surprised to learn that Mormons are not all the perfect people that I thought they were. All of the people that I had met so far had been the kind that could go to hell and turn one corner of hell into a heaven. Now I began to meet a few residents of some of the other corners. I requested from BYU Housing an exact room location in their on-campus housing because I felt that it was important to be near some good friends. I was told that it would be impossible to obtain that narrow of a selection since housing availability was at a premium. Through an absolute miracle, my name came up on a very long list at the exact moment that the room I had requested became available. The reason I made it to Chipman Hall, 3rd floor, right wing, was soon to become apparent. The Lord has promised to teach us line upon line, in other words, one thing at a time. Mormons were such perfect beings to me, I just wasn't ready to learn how imperfect some of them really are, self included. I was soon to learn this very important concept that the reader would do well to ponder before he reads any more of this book. I am about to discuss somewhat of a sacred cow in all religious bodies. No one wants anyone else to know that there are some really weird people in all of our family trees. But there is a reason why we should sooner or later all come to each other with this confession. And isn't it all too obvious that this is because we need to stop condemning large groups of people because of the ever-present crackpots within that group? Upon showing this manuscript to a number of my friends, a small portion of them expressed to me the fear that perhaps the anti-Mormon forces would try to use this book to contest the validity of the LDS Church if I mentioned anything less than perfect Mormon behavior. Well, that would certainly put this book in some very good company. Having once been a Sunday school teacher in the Church of Christ, teaching out of books called Mormonism Exposed and others like it, I am very familiar with the books that those anti-Mormon people use to attack Mormonism, namely the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, etc. However, the concern of these friends causes me to wonder, because I have also been charged by several to tell these stories for the benefit of the church. Many have told me after telling these stories from the pulpit that they have been converted to the church by such stories. So what am I to do? Pondering this question brings up another. Is the church A, made up of perfect people, or B, an organization designed by the Lord to lead imperfect people a little bit closer to perfection? If you have been contending that the Mormon Church is true because A is the way you believe, then this book could be used by anti-Mormon forces to attack your creed. If you have been suspecting, however, that B is the answer to the question that has been posed, then your faith is on a more solid foundation, and you may read on without fear. When David O. McKay, the prophet, seer, and revelator of the entire Mormon Church, came to BYU, only a small portion of the guys on my floor attended his speech. I returned to the residence hall dismayed to find over half of them sprawled out on their beds listening to the latest hits. But this was only a symptom of the syndrome within. No one could suspect that here among these young sons of bishops, stake presidents, and other just plain Mormons had grown some twisted minds. A large gathering attracted my attention to the door of one room, and inside I saw a large fencing of stolen goods operation. I thought it was very strange that no one had squealed on them, so I gathered up a list of names and saved the Provo J.C. Penney Company about $4,000 or $5,000. Remember, I still was operating under the notion that the answer to the question posed a while back was A. So I was a little shocked when one evening as I sat in my room studying, a mob piled into my room threatening me with my very life to be snuffed away just as soon as they all had their grades and credits from BYU at the end of the semester. I couldn't take this seriously, so noticing that the leader of the group was conspicuously absent, I pushed my way through this squirrely crew down to his room. At my knock, he swung wide the door and hollered in R-rated verbiage, "What do you want?" or words to that effect. I answered, "I missed you at the celebration of my forthcoming demise up at my room, and I came down to see why you weren't there. Look, stupid, you don't even realize what you have just done to me. I was going to be married in the temple this summer. Now, because of you, her parents will call off the whole thing. I have been on probation, and this means I will probably have to go to jail. It's all your fault. I'm so mad I could break you in little pieces." I couldn't help seeing humor in this awesome situation. I knew that he was so blinded to the irony of his plight that I risked getting my beak crushed by saying, "Oh, you don't have to thank me. I was just running a little errand for the Lord. He told me that he'd like to see you make it back to heaven, and he figures you'd like heaven a little bit more if you quit being a thief first. You see, down here, you can steal something and no one sees you do it. But if you try that up there, you'll make a big spectacle out of yourself. Then you would get thrown out of heaven, and that would pretty much put an end to that temple wedding anyway." His response to this startled me. I saw a spark of the divine in him when he said, "Stealing has been a habit with me for as long as I can remember. You don't know how hard I've been trying to change. Maybe you have helped me after all. Things are getting so out of hand that my life is getting ruined." We had a nice talk. We shook hands. Outside his door, a large crowd had gathered and pushed into the room apparently to plot my destruction. What happened here has served to further convince me that I must write this book regardless of the fact that I am going to have to discuss some bad behavior on the part of more and more Latter-day Saints. Everyone quieted down when they saw what a change had taken place in this person. Nothing was ever said again. It just ended right there. Oh yes, he was married in the temple a lot later. Sometimes exposing poor behavior out into the open is the only way to bring about a cure. Oh, how I pray that this will be the case as I continue the story of my quest to find and fulfill my mission for the Lord, and of necessity tell of some poorly behaving Latter-day Saints who thwarted my mission. May 1961, I was about to be ordained an elder. As I sat in the room with about 30 others who were also to be ordained, I was unnerved by the fear that perhaps I was not worthy to receive such a high calling. By now, I had seen so many who had taken upon themselves the priesthood of God who were so terribly unworthy that I began to worry about the eternal consequences for myself. I had read that it would be better to have a concrete necktie cast around your neck and then to be thrown into the depths of the sea than to receive the priesthood of God unworthily. I actually became so frightened that I prayed that a fire or a bad chemical lab odor or something might break out in the building so that this whole thing could be called off, all because I did not have the nerve to bolt out of there and express to someone that I did not feel worthy. I asked the Lord, since neither fire nor bad odor nor alternate crisis broke out, if maybe he couldn't provide some indicator of how he felt about me receiving the priesthood. Just any small sign would do, Lord. My name was called. Slowly I got up to go forward. The fathers of some of the young men had come from all over the country to be here at this important occasion. For me, it would just be me and my friend, Bishop Lester Downing, the man who would bestow this great blessing upon my head. The good bishop began with these words: "The Lord wants you to know that he is pleased with the step that you are taking at this time." I suppose 1,000,000 ordinations have begun with such worn-out wording, but the Spirit bore witness and made me cry like a baby, and I knew that everything was okay. And I had learned another great lesson that I want to be able to teach my children, to wit, us dads are always happy with our children when they do something to show that they really love us. Our Father in heaven is not any different. He is really quite easy to please. Chapter 6. In the summer of 1961, I returned home from BYU alive. I was still wondering how to find and fulfill my mission in life. I was more sure than ever that my mission included building a recording studio after somehow gaining an insight into the whole popular music business. I felt that first I would have to become a very successful disc jockey in some large city. This would lead to working for some major recording label as a songwriter, and the subsequent pile of wealth that I would accumulate would make it possible to become the Walt Disney type that would proctor some Pat Boone types. Before I could even think about finding a job on some major radio station, I would have to obtain the proper FCC license. Before I could obtain the first-class license, I would have to attend Grantham Electronics School in Hollywood, California. Before I could attend the school, I would have to raise the necessary $500 for the tuition. Before I could raise the $500, I needed to pay off many debts that had arisen 1 year ago when I lost all of my income. Sister Burkhead had prophesied that her dream would mean that I would probably lose all that I had as Satan would attempt to bring a squalor of loneliness down around me. Lonely? I was becoming very lonely. To make matters worse, many friends would ask, "Why don't you go on a mission like everybody else?" Then when I would explain that I was interviewed to go on a mission, but I was never called, they would raise their eyebrows. Then when I would tell them of how I planned to become another Walt Disney type, and how I would then flood the music business with Mormon Pat Boone types, it was no wonder that I found no self-respecting young lady who would get involved in a meaningful relationship with me. So with no one to lean on, and no one to believe in me but me, I began to pray and seek for a rung on the slippery ladder to success. At first I wouldn't take a job unless it was related to the radio, TV, music business, but I became so dejected after several months of frustration. Finally, in October 1961, I went to work as a photographer on a missile base. This led me to Moses Lake, Washington. As I drove into Moses Lake, I noticed that there was a very large Mormon stake center in this little town of 12,000 people. Having had a teenage nightclub in a similar-sized building, I thought how marvelous it would be if some LDS Pat Boone type could pack all of the local youth into this huge cultural hall. Fitting right into this vision was the fact that last June at BYU, I met a fine person by the name of Bobby Ingeman. This man had put together a trio called the Letterman. He had told me to watch for their first release. If I were to return to Washington and return to being a DJ, then perhaps I could help his group get started. They didn't need my help. Their first record, The Way You Look Tonight, was a #1 smash. In November 1961, I told the stake presidency of my idea of having the Letterman be the drawing card for what was to become the first attempt at proving my theory about using performers to bring people into the church. Presidents Baker, Stevens, and Earl asked how much it might cost to pull off such a concert by the Letterman. I told them that when I had various famous people come to my teenage nightclub in Kennewick, Washington, it would usually cost $400 to $500 per night. Isn't that a joke? At the writing of this book, a similar booking would cost at least $10,000. Remember, this was back before rock and roll was big business. Now, here is the shocker. Back then, to these hard-working ranchers, you could buck 100-pound bales in the hot sun all day for $1 per hour. Who on earth would pay any kid $500 to sing off-key for one short evening? They agreed, however, that I should at least ask the Letterman for their going price to appear December 9th or the 16th and see if they would actually travel up from California for such an occasion. Elated at the possibility of finally getting a chance to test my idea, I ran home at 11 p.m. to my apartment. I called long distance to the number that Bobby had given me when we met at BYU to his telephone in Van Nuys, California. The number was disconnected. Despairing, I prayed. I arose. I felt impressed to ask the operator to help me find the number for Capitol Records in either New York, Chicago, or Hollywood. I didn't have any idea where it was. A Hollywood operator gave me one number to call before 5 p.m. and another number to call after 5 p.m. Now, what are the odds that a building 13 stories high with over 2,000 telephones would have anyone in it at midnight that would be willing to give out the phone number of a famous recording star so that I could get in touch with Bobby Ingeman that night for a youth conference for the LDS Church? Just the thought of the tremendous odds against me was enough to make me nervous. But you have to remember sometimes that when you are on an errand for the Lord, that you have to get used to needing miracles and getting one every now and then. When the phone rang in that great big building at nearly midnight, it rang outside the studio portion of the Capitol Record Tower. Inside the studio, at that moment, one of the hundreds of groups and recording artists working with Capitol Records, a group called the Lettermen, had just finished a take on a song called When I Fall in Love, their next #1 smash. Within seconds, Bobby was on the line. Every time my testimony gets shell-shocked in the testimony war, this is one of the events of my life that I dwell on, to rebuild my faith that when God wants you to accomplish something, He will help. Simple thing, this basic faith business about God being able to part any old Red Sea that gets in the way. But the telling of this miracle story is only half over. This historic moment in my life began. Bob, you won't remember me. My name is Lynn Bryson. Oh, yes, I remember you. We met last June at BYU. You're the DJ from Washington State. I was very impressed. Right, Bob. The stake president up here wants to know if you're available to do a youth conference December 9th or the 16th. Impossible. We are booked up for the next 3 months. I heard some pages flipping. Let's see. We're here in the studio doing our next recording then. Hold on. December 16th? No, I've got to do my thing with the Air National Guard that whole weekend. But December 9th? Would you believe that is the only date we could come up to Washington in the next 3 or 4 months? Nice going. Lynn, how much can they pay? If it were just me, we wouldn't have to worry. I am a returned LDS missionary. Jim Pike in the group is an elder also. But here's the kicker. Tony Butala is a really great guy, but he is a Catholic. And the same goes for Jess Rand, our manager, and he is a Jew. So you see, since this is what we all do for a living, we will have to be paid. Bob, you can work that number out from your end and then call me back and tell me how much you'll have to be paid, and let's do it. I explained to Bob as much as I could how important this was to try out this theory of mine and that this was the perfect time and place to get the idea off the ground. Bob seemed to catch the whole vision instantly. I wanted him to know that this would be the first youth conference ever held by the church that was officially to be for non-members. He agreed that the plan was at least worth our best shot. However, he called me back at 6 a.m. Would you believe that Jess Rand had called him at 5 a.m.? Jess had obtained another booking at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas. You guessed it, December 8th, 9th, and 10th. My heart sunk. Then I found out why the Lord provided the miracle of being able to find Bob the night before at the studio, and why I had received such a strong impression to go ahead and call that late capital number, even though it appeared to be a hopeless waste of time. Bob admitted, "It was an absolute miracle that you got in touch with me last night. The Lord must want this youth conference to happen with us performing there." I felt impressed to tell Jess that we had already booked a big deal in Washington State, and I convinced him that we needed exposure in that area, and that many people would be disappointed, and it would really hurt our image if we didn't show. I really heaped it on, but now he wants to know how much we are being paid. He says that he won't let us do it unless we are paid the same amount that he has lined up for us in Vegas. Now I knew the deal was sunk. He said that they needed $850 plus $250 for expenses. Gasp. At the presidency meeting, just when I knew all was lost, President Stevens, one of my favorite people, grinned about how his mission had cost him not only more than 2 years of his life, but, he added, $2,500 in cold, hard cash. Then he chirped, "Does anybody here want to say that I made a poor investment?" All agreed that if he had only baptized one soul, it would have still been a bargain. For what price can you put on a soul? It was then agreed by all that the potential for convert baptisms at such a meeting as the Letterman could provide could work out to be another of that same kind of bargain, cash and time-wise, and especially soul-wise. President Stevens joked something about how if $1,000 could bring 100 baptisms, that would only work out to be about $10 per head. And then he said, the last time I bought a calf, it must have cost me at least $50 per head. Everyone there folded with laughter, and the rest is history. The youth of the stake held a 24-hour fast for the success of the whole affair. Maybe that is why the spirit was so mighty at this youth conference. I was put in charge of a central planning committee, so I warned the youth that in inviting their non-member friends to this function, they should be careful to make sure their friends understood that the reason we were having this event was not just some mere publicity stunt.